To the memory of Benjamin Gimbert, driver, and James Nighthall, fireman, London and North Eastern Railway. Both were awarded the George Cross for extreme heroism when a wagon on a train fully laden with bombs caught fire and exploded at Soham Station early on the morning of the 2nd of June 1944.
Well, he noticed that the second truck was alight. He said, "We shall have to get this away," and he asked Jimmy to uncouple the truck and get it out onto a waste piece of land away from the station. And Jimmy he said, "Take the coal hammer in case the couplings are hot," which he did, and came back on the engine. And they stood side by side, and it went up.
That sound woke the sleeping town of Soham. Indeed, it was heard as far away as Saffron Walden. It was a sound which was destined to bring sadness and tragedy to some, and immense glory to others. One of the first on the scene was leading fireman Eric Isaacson.
On that night, or morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, we was awakened by this terrific explosion, and when I got up, I can't remember who it was, but somebody came and told me that I'd got to report in my capacity as a leading fireman with the National Fire Service to my commanding officer, Section Leader Gidney, at the gasworks. And on arrival, I saw this huge fire, and I had no idea what had happened. I thought a bomb had dropped somewhere because there was an aircraft flying overhead. I reported to my CO, and he instructed me to take the messenger boy, a young fellow named Bucknell, over to the goods yard, where he had a report that there was a small outbreak of a fire, and that I then had to send a report back to him. I went to the goods yard and found there was no fire other than a few old sacks, which I stamped out, and sent the messenger boy back very quickly with the message. As I made my way back to the gasworks, an American officer, I didn't know who he was or where he came from, asked me if I knew where the firemen were. I said, "Yes, they're in the gasworks." He said, "Not them, the fellow with the train." Well, I said, "What train?" Because I had no idea that there'd been an explosion or a train blew up. And I went with him when he said to me, "Come with me," and we slithered into this hole where this huge War Department railway engine was lying on its right-hand side, and I still didn't know what we were looking for. There was me, this Air Force officer, which was an American Air Force officer, and 2 other chaps who I can't think and remember who they were. This officer had a torch which he shone through the steam and said, "There he is." And I looked and could see this body. And this officer looked at me, he said, "You're the smallest, crawl under the wheels and see if we can get him out." I was scared to death at the time, I can assure you. And I crawled under this engine, which was hissing with steam from broken pipes, managed to maneuver this body round a bit so that the chaps behind me could pull him out. I always have thought that this American officer must have been a doctor, because what he then did was to bend over the body, pull the eyelid back, and said, "He's dead. Let's get him out of here."
The rescue operation continued all around, and railway guard Freddie Dickinson soon arrived on a rescue train from Cambridge. He remembers how his night was disturbed.
There was a knock at my door about 3 o'clock in the morning, and asking me would I go and report, and where I picked the accident vans up. That included the crane. And also, apart from that, they had a crane from the London area as well. It was really terrible, it was really. First of all, it had blown all the newsagents, where the, Smiths, they blew that clean away. And they found the station master's wife walking up the street in a nightgown. She didn't know where she was going. And there the engine laid there, just where it had dropped in this here bomb hole, and it was level, the chimney was level with the track.
It would be a miracle, surely, if anyone could have survived an explosion which had made a crater big enough for a locomotive to rest in, almost at ground level. As you'll hear, Violet Gimbert has her own theories of how Ben survived, but she also vividly remembers how her night was disturbed.
Well, it was 5:30 in the morning, and my neighbour knocked at the door and called out for me to come down. And I said, "What's the matter?" I said, "It's Ben, isn't it?" And he said, "Yes, come along down and we'll tell you." And a railway man was there, and he said they'd been on the phone to all the hospitals and couldn't find out where they'd taken Ben. And then he came back again while we was there. We had a cup of tea and was talking, and he came back to say it was White Lodge, Newmarket. And he'd been to see about the trains, and the train had gone, and there weren't many that time of day, it was wartime. And the next thing was to go by bus, which I did. They held the bus up at Ely for two passengers, my dad and I went all the way by bus. But one of the first things he said to me was, "Where's Jimmy? Have they brought him here?" I said, "Well, I don't know." I said, "I've just arrived." He said, "Well, go and look in that ward." And three different wards he sent me to look in. And I said, "No, I can't find him, Dad." I said, "I don't think he's here." He said, "Go and ask that nurse." So I went and asked nurse and explained what happened. She said, "Well," I said, "what shall I tell him?" She said, "Tell him I've just come on duty and I'll find out later on." I told him that. And then, of course, we talked about the girls and how I got there and different things. And I kept doing that all day, trying to pass it off. And then police came and railway officials. They came one after the other taking notes and asking him questions. And I visited him again after dinner, and he didn't mention it then because we'd other visitors. But we kept it from him right until the evening, and then one of the men that had been helping fill up the crater, he came and shook hands. He said, "I congratulate you, Ben." He said, "You've done a wonderful job." He said, "But a pity your farm was killed." Oh, and he sunk down in the bed. He was just nearly collapsed.
What state was Mr. Gimbert in when you first saw him?
Well, he was calm and he was very dirty, just as he'd come off the engine. And he talked to me. I didn't ask him exactly where he was hurt, but I saw the cradle over his legs and a blanket across him, and nothing much on. And his back was very badly cut, and his arm in splints.
How badly damaged was the arm?
Well, the hand was shattered. The shrapnel went through, well, I could see of it right through the hand. And then this big hole, a stone in his arm, and that was where they were going to take it off. But his flesh healed so well. The flesh saved his bones. The old professor told me in the hospital that his flesh saved his bones. But Jimmy was so thin, I don't think I've ever seen a thinner man. Well, it broke his neck and his back. I mean, he had no chance, because they stood side by side. But the tale went that it blew my husband over the station roof. He was stumbling outside, and the only wound he had in the front of his body was where he stumbled, caught his shin. It was all the blast, you see, caught his back. When I came home and undone his clothes, Mother walked in. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm seeing where he's hurt." And I put his pants, his vest, his waistcoat, and everything in the kitchen, laid it out. I said, "I don't like that." That was a big hole in the left side of his back. I thought it caught his lung. That was what was worrying me, because he had pleurisy. And I could see all these, it was in ribbons. My daughter had some braces made for him. He was 19 stone, and the bought ones weren't no good, at the harness makers. And they were thick webbing, and that had gone through all his slop, his overall, through his clothes. And he wore a leather belt, and that had pecked into that. His back caught the worst. When I used to go, I said, "Well, how are you getting on now?" "Well, I've been on the slab again," he'd say. He called it, that was operating. He used to go and have pieces, most days taken. My sister sat there, she came in one, and she said, "What's shining in your thumb, Ben?" It was a piece of glass, you could see the sun. And when he got home, he used to sit there in the evening. I said, "Whatever's the matter with you?" "Oh, I don't need to pick out a piece of glass." We'd find pieces in the bed. He was peppered. One of the doctors said they should put him back to a magnet and drop him.
After the accident, did Ben return to driving?
Yes, on the diesels though. Diesels had just come out and they made him like an 8-hour job, which he could manage. And that they told him that if ever he felt ill or tired, he was to go home. Wasn't to stay if he, felt done up. But that was the finest thing that happened, the diesels, because he wouldn't have gone on the main line again. I don't see how he could have done with that arm.
By Ben's prompt action, the explosion was confined to the leading wagon they had managed to uncouple and move away from the remaining 50. However, further care was necessary to prevent more explosions. Eric Isaacson describes the technicalities of the mopping up operations.
Then, of course, they sent up a wagon, which in those days was known as zone control, like a huge red and white draft board painted on the side. And when the red light on that flashed, that was a signal to all officers not in charge of an appliance to report there. This I did, and the officer inside showed me a map on the wall and asked me if I knew where the hydrants were down this particular road, me aside. I said yes, and he said, well, go out there, take Z1, that was the code number of a new market wagon, and set in at this hydrant and take a line of hose through this coal yard and cover the remaining trucks. I did this, and when I got to this wagon, it was a friend of mine, leading fireman Jeffries, who was the editor of the Newmarket Journal, and we went and did this job, and we were then promptly ordered away by a more senior officer because these trucks looked like big boxes of cigars, because one of them had ordered us to go and feel the axle box to see if they were hot. Well, we were so scared we didn't know they were hot or cold. Anyway, we made up and got out, as the order was, and then we just assisted where we could, helping to put people in ambulances and so on. And I left the scene then at about 7:30 in the morning.
Within a very short time of the tragedy, there were whispers that decorations of a very high order were likely to be bestowed, and on the 25th of July 1944, Ben and his fireman were both awarded the George Cross. Part of the citation reads, Gimbert and Nighthall were fully aware of the contents of the wagon, which was on fire, and displayed outstanding courage and resource in endeavouring to isolate it. When they discovered that the wagon was on fire, they could easily have left the train and sought shelter, but they risked their lives in order to minimise the effect of the fire. There is no doubt that if the whole train had been involved, as it would have been but for the gallant action of the men concerned, there would have been serious loss of life and property. I asked Violet how this, the highest award which can be afforded a civilian for heroism and gallantry, and one which is the equal of the Victoria Cross, changed their lives.
Oh dear. Well, we were just ordinary people, and I don't think it changed our lives at all, only that we been to so many wonderful places. When they formed the association, the VC and GC Association, he joined straight away, and they held the reunion every other year for 3 days, and that made us some wonderful outings to Buckingham Palace, garden parties, Windsor Castle, Mansion House, Earl's Court, no end of wonderful places we've been to, and I never dreamt that I should ever go to Buckingham Palace to tea or meet the Queen, come to that.
How many times did you meet the Queen then?
4 times. 3 times at Buckingham Palace and at Windsor Castle. And the Duke of Edinburgh, of course. Well, they made a cocktail party. Princess Margaret was the guest of honour. She said, she was the guest of honour, but she said, I'm so honoured to think that I'm with the most honoured men in the country, the Queen's bravest men. I had her speech for a year. I don't know whether I've still got it, but do you know my husband, when we used to have children come in to see him, they all wanted to see him, and he'd say, you can have that, you can have that. He'd give Princess Anne's speech away, Lady Churchill's speech away, and we had a letter from Churchill, a telegram, and where that went, I don't know. I think he gave it to somebody.
Suddenly, It seemed this hitherto modest and very ordinary couple had been plucked from relative obscurity and were to become quite regularly feted by some of the nation's leading figures. Meetings with members of the government and the royal family became commonplace, and I asked Violet what everyone else wanted to know. How does a conversation with the Queen of England proceed? What kind of thing would the Queen ask?
She wanted to know what happened on that night, and he explained, and she was so interested. You know, she was nodding her head and asking him questions, and he was explaining.
Did she remember him when she saw him again?
At the second reception at the palace, yes, she said, "Oh, the engine driver." Yes, I was surprised. And he'd seen her on that fast train. She went to London, I believe, did she? Driving. And of course he said he was pleased to see her shown on the television driving the... Oh, she didn't go 95 miles an hour, you know, was getting at him. So I was wonderfully natural.
As time went by, the family passed on with pride the story of Ben's heroic actions to the up-and-coming generations of his family. And indeed, Violet boasted proudly to me that some of the younger ones knew more about it than she did. Why then, some 8 years after his death, did she decide to dispose of the medals?
Well, I wanted to buy a new flat, and I needed a little extra cash from selling my house to the taking over the flat. I needed a little more, and I thought, well, Ben would want me to do this, make this move, because the stairs were too much for me, and it was a big garden which was overgrown, much too much for me. And we thought it out with the family, and the medals were in the bank. I didn't see them, and I thought it was a thing that he would wish me to do.
How did you feel about selling them?
Well, I did feel it, because they were very nice to have, such an honour, but the honour's still there, and the medals I shall see quite often, I hope.
What are your feelings about Mr. Clayton's returning them here to March?
Very, very nice of him, because it seems to me they're coming home. And if such a thing, they're in the museum or the Fendon District Hall, whichever they choose, I can see them, and it'll give everyone that is interested an opportunity to see them. Otherwise, they'd be in the bank year after year, and nobody knew anything about them.
Circumstances then dictated that Violet had no option but to sell the treasured possessions, and on the 28th of June the medals came up for auction at Sotheby's. Several people were most interested in Lot 654, the Coronation Medal, the Daily Herald Medal for Industrial Heroism, the LNER Medal, and the George Cross. Among the contenders, a foreign bidder and the National Railway Museum at York. When the hammer fell, however, the successful bidder was Essex businessman Christopher Clayton, who bought them for £7,000. And when I spoke to Mr. Clayton later, when he came to Cambridge to finalise arrangements for the ceremony which occurred during the week at March Station, I asked him why he'd bought the medals.
Because of my sincere admiration for the train driver concerned and the fireman. I think it's one of the most incredible acts of heroism by a train driver that I've ever heard of. And I speak personally because two of us on the train have had our lives saved by the skill of a train driver. It was on the Great Western in 1974, so it's nice to put something back in return.
Was it just the specific act that fired your imagination, or was it the general concept of the heroism of these people all the way through the war?
It was really both, in fact.
Who's to present the medal back to the town?
Mrs. Gimbert.
Will it be a gift or will it be a permanent loan?
Oh, it was a gift.
Mr. Clayton was true to his word, and in a biting cold wind, civic dignitaries and railway officials assembled on the down platform at March to await the arrival of the medals, which were travelling on the 0853 from London Liverpool Street, for that day extended to March. In 1981, British Rail honoured the heroism of both Ben and his fireman Jimmy Nighthall by naming two Class 47 locomotives after them, and shortly after 11:15, 47577 Benjamin Gimbert GC drew into March Station, bringing with it Mr. Clayton and the medals. The medals were to be received by the Mayor of March, Councillor Donald Douglas, and as the train drew in, I asked him for his reaction to the medals' return and how he thought the town would feel.
Oh, I think it's a great honour because we are a railway town, And during the war, the railmen from here did take these trains to London. They were in the London Blitz, they were in the bombs at Nottingham and Norwich and elsewhere. And so they were in the front line, in effect. And they played a big part in it. I myself spent many, many nights in London during the Blitz with trains. So we feel that this is, if it's going to be presented to any town, we deserve it. And I think Ben Gimbert, really, what he did, the heroism that he did, really reflects the courage that the railmen had, that if they faced this disaster, which we did take many trains of bombs and ammunition and deadly cargoes, but we knew the consequences if anything went wrong, and we had to save town the same as he saved Soham. Oh, it was a great effort, and I think the comeback to march is on Mr. Clayton's part. I think it's a wonderful gesture, and I'm sure all the people of March will appreciate and always look on it as Ben Gimbert George Cross, but very grateful to the people of March for what he's done.
Did you know Mr. Nighthall and Mr. Gimbert?
Oh yes, they were colleagues of mine, yes. Yes, I have fired with Mr. Gimbert in the early part of the war many times, yes.
Can you tell me where they'll be stored?
No, because at the moment they're going to be in the bank. We've just got to decide where to put them permanently. So it's something we haven't come to. Of course, there is the insurance and the security, which has got to be gone into, and at the moment they're going to be placed in the bank.
Coinciding with the return home to March of Ben's medals, British Rail have attached a commemorative scroll to the wall of the booking office, which bears the words with which I began this programme. Mike Donnelly, Cambridge area manager, explained the reason why British Rail became involved.
Well, Ben Gimbert was a driver of March. March has a long railway history, and central to that railway history is the action of Ben and his fireman, James Nighthall. And I believe, although we have a monument at Soham, and now gladly Ben's medal has returned to March, that we ourselves should make some permanent reminder of their action in June 1944.
It should be said, however, that Ben Gimbert and Jimmy Nighthall were not the only participants in the drama which took place that night. Also playing parts were the guard on the train, Herbert Clark, and the station signalman, Frank Bridges. Leading fireman Isaacson was one of the first rescuers on the scene. Indeed, he pulled Jimmy Nighthall from beneath the toppled locomotive. I asked him whether he recalled seeing any other railway personnel.
No, I didn't see any other railwomen other than when I arrived, they were then removing Mr. Bridges on a stretcher to take him to hospital. I didn't see Mr. Gimbert, and I didn't see Mr. Clark, and the only time I saw Mr. Bridges when they was taking him away from the scene. I didn't even see the station master, Mr. Harry, I can't remember his name, because they got him out of the house, and only a few seconds after they got him out, the whole thing collapsed like a pack of cards.
What can you tell us about Mr. Bridges?
Well, Mr. Bridges, he saw this train and truck on fire. He left the signal box with a couple of bales of water, hoping that that would do some good, and he was ordered back to the signal box by Mr. Gimbert. And of course, poor chap, he didn't quite make it. Had he have got round the corner of the signal box, he may well have been injured, but I don't think he'd have probably been killed. But it would appear that the blast simply smashed him down onto the platform, and that, unfortunately, was where he sustained his fatal injuries.
From what you know personally, and from what you've since learned, do you think that enough people were recognised for their actions that night?
No, I don't, because Guard Clark and Signalman Bridges, after all, they did their bit, and it was only a question of a couple of more medals, and I think that they should have been honoured, because Mr. Bridges, he could, when he saw that truck, he knew what was in that truck. He could have run across those fields and probably been alive today. Equally, Guard Clark, as the law says on British Rail, or any rail, when that train is in motion, the driver is in charge. Immediately that stops, the guard is in charge. He came along, gave instructions to what to be done, and then went bravely back along the line after the explosion, putting detonators down right to Barway siding, which must be all of 3.5 to 4 miles, where he collapsed at the foot of the signal box, which was upstairs, up steps, And Mr. King, the signalman, came down the steps, carried him up into the box, phoned an ambulance and got him into hospital. And I think that what Clark did, he should have been recognised, and equally so should Signalman Bridges.
Eric Isaacson was not the only person to put forward the view that further decorations may perhaps have been in order, and indeed on the morning following the tragedy, Sir Will Spence, the regional commissioner, visited the scene of devastation and called for a report on the gallantry of the 3 men involved, promising that the report would be passed to the Minister of Home Security with a recommendation that they be awarded the George Cross. I approached British Rail's area manager Mike Donnelly again, this time to ask why he thought others had apparently been neglected.
I'm afraid I can't really comment on that. The giving of medals of this nature is not within my or indeed the Railways Authority, and wouldn't wish to make any further comment on that, and suggest perhaps that you ask elsewhere.
So we did approach a higher authority, British Rail's Eastern Region headquarters in York, who were most helpful. However, with an accident that occurred over 40 years ago on a railway owned by a now defunct private company, the LNER, whose records lie in dusty tomes on the shelves of the Public Record Office in Kew, the reason why only 2 of the 3 men recommended by the Regional Commissioner for commendation seem to have passed into obscurity. The one fact of which we can be sure is that Ben Gimbert and Jimmy Nighthall received their awards for the highest bravery without regard for their own safety. Jimmy's medal is on permanent display in Soham Village College. Ben's, as you've heard, having been sold, have now come home to March. Ever since her decision to sell the medals, Violet has been besieged by the media. She told me how unexpected the resulting publicity was.
Well, in the first place, the reporter from the Cambridgeshire Times came down, Anne Campbell, and I told her the story, and I thought that would go in the local paper and that would be an end. That would be all the publicity. And from then, the next morning, the BBC rung up, could she come? And the ITV, they wanted to come to see me. And after that, there was phone messages, would I speak and would I tell them the story and answer a few questions, and which I did, and that happened hour after hour for several days.
How did you cope with it all?
Well, I'd done the best I could. In fact, it nearly drove me balmy.
The years since the accident have rolled by, and we, as outsiders, are left to remember Ben and his heroism through fading newspaper cuttings in library archives and plaques on walls of buildings, and now and again as we stand on railway stations and the Class 47 engine which bears his name roars by. But how, in the evening of her life, does this warm, unpretentious and undisputed First Lady of March remember the years she spent at the side of the man she shared half a century with and who was to become a legend in his own lifetime?
Well, he was very staid in his ways. You couldn't alter him if he got anything in his mind. You couldn't alter him. But he was very manly in so many other ways, a good husband and a good father. We were married 53 years. He weighed 19 stone, you know. He was a big man. And he was a good billiard player. He held the cup at the Conservative Club, no, the Liberal Club. And he loved cards, dominoes. And a homely man, really, because my 2 daughters, he wouldn't allow them to dance. And they'd bring their young men in and they'd play dominoes hours and hours. He went to work and done his gardening, and he liked to pint, come home late for dinner, and I was cross. We made it up. Although
What sort of a man was he about the house?
not a bit of good. When he was off an engine and off the garden, I told him he wasn't much good. I didn't want him, while I was well, I didn't want him to do housework, but he wouldn't have known how. He couldn't have done it. He washed up with him while I was in the hospital.